everybody. My name is Suyong. I'm also a human rights investigator here in NKDB. I've been here for about 3 years. I mainly interview North Korean escapees and gather their information and use their information for advocacy work. Thank you for your invitation, and hopefully we can have a very interesting dialogue. So I was very interested in the 20th century history, especially I was very into learning about the totalitarian states, but I was not very much into the regimes themselves, but I was very interested in how individuals lived under those conditions and cope with their reality. So I was particularly drawn to the issues of like freedom of expression and freedom of religion, how guaranteeing these fundamental rights could prevent, let's say, the rise of those regimes. So the books that I was quite inspired by was, I don't know this in English, but it's from Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. Yeah, I think hopefully I've pronounced that right. And also The Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. These books really shaped my thinking. In the same context, I started reading about North Korean history. And honestly, I was very shocked, not just by the gravity of the issue, but by the fact that it was a continuous and continuing issue. So that realization really pushed me to dig further and by engaging specifically with the survivors. So that experience led me to work here in NKDB. So it wasn't like I specifically set out to build a career specifically in documentation, but rather it was my curiosity, a lack of a better word, and a sense of a responsibility that really led me to work here in this field. Documentation usually goes through several steps. First, we conduct in-depth interviews with the North Korean escapees. And most of the escapees that we meet are the recent arrivals. And we typically hold interviews at a educational facility where they learn about their life in South Korea before integrating into our society. So we basically interview them and record the cases of human rights violations that they have experienced in North Korea. So we basically gather and analyze their stories by using our own classification system. So many of the stories that they talk about usually revolves around like serious human rights violation that includes like summary executions, arbitrary detention, and forced repatriation. Then, when we hear these stories, we document these incidents under the 16 types in our own system, which is based on international human rights norms. So, for example, these 16 rights include right to life, right to individual dignity and liberty, right to freedom of speech, belief, and expression, and so on. So we sort of use this framework not only to document individual cases for accountability, but we also use this to evaluate and monitor the overall human rights situation in North Korea. For those who are interested in in the findings the recent findings, you can check our website and see the summary version of the white paper on North Korean human rights. There we provide sort of the ways in which we do our documentation and provide statistics of each of the 16 categories that I've just laid out. So you can have a good sense of how we work looking at that material. Yeah, first off, I think everything that I do in NKDB needs to be practical. What I mean by that is that our activities should be should lead to a very real and tangible outcomes. That's how I view documentation also. So it's not just about keeping records for future justice. I think it needs to be very useful in the present moment as well. And one of the aspects that I find particularly interesting is using documentation for non-judicial accountability. So as you guys may know, achieving judicial accountability is extremely limited when a country remain divided. So in this context, I think creating a platform for memorialization and exhibition can make a meaningful contribution to the psychological well-being of the North Korean escapees. And one of the projects, I'm not sure whether Unique have introduced this, but one of the projects we undertook was an exhibition on freedom of speech in North Korea. So basically, we analyzed the cases of free speech violations that occurred in North Korea from our database and extracted excerpts and with the victims' consent, presented their stories through the exhibition. So basically, the goal was to highlight the lived experiences of victims and the systematic nature of the human rights abuses in North Korea. So in South Korea, maybe you guys know the media coverage of North Korea usually are tainted by the regime's nuclear issue or the stories of Kim Jong-un, but it has very limited information about the ordinary life of the citizens. So I think the exhibition tries to offer a platform to highlight the experiences of the North Koreans and their perception of victimhood to domestic and international audience. Speaking from my experience at NKDB, I believe that there are some key skills and experiences that human rights documenters need to have, especially in the North Korean context. I think, firstly, it's extremely important to build trust with the victims. So, for starters, for some practical advice is to have a good understanding of the geography of their place of birth, and being able to speak their local language, I think is a good start to establish that trust. I think the best way to build trust is by showing a genuine interest in the beneficiary's background. And this means going beyond superficial portrayals of North Korea in the media and instead focusing on the aspects that are most relatable to the beneficiaries, things like culture, societal issues, and social cultural background, and how that reflects their daily lives. So I think the most fastest and the most effective way to show this is by showing proficient in the language they speak and demonstrating your knowledge about their hometown. And I think that building this report really determines the quality of the interview because when they start to trust the interviewer, they tell you all sorts of information, and this information could really help them to get the redress they need. To answer your question, I think NKDB does its best to take a victim-centered approach to documentation and all the activities that we do. I think there are many ways to define what it means, but at its core, I think it comes down to prioritizing the needs and the desires of the victims. So I think human rights documenters need to be acutely aware of what survivors want from the documentation process, whether it's simply recording their experiences for future transitional justice or using their testimonies for advocacy or for judicial or non-judicial accountability. So to give you a little context, there are 34,000 North Korean escapees here living in South Korea. Not a lot of them are willing to come forward and share their experiences for the purpose of documentation because many struggle with securing stable employment. There are feelings of isolation, and there are overwhelming challenges of navigating their life here in South Korea. South Korea is a pretty competitive country to survive. So one of the projects that I'm particularly interested in is expanding sort of an outreach program that informs victims about their rights and the utility of the documentation, whether it could be used for judicial and non-judicial pathways. And through this, we really want to encourage participation, but more importantly, we want to really understand what their needs and preferences they have with this accountability pathways. So I'll say that what we try to do is adopt a victim-centered approach to all of the activities that we do, especially we think that this principle needs to be applied when we do our documentation. I think I have already mentioned this, but it's really hard to encourage their participation in the documentation process. And it is totally understandable because their main interest is not getting a sort of a redress for the past experience. Their main focus is the present moment. They are much more focused on getting a stable job and formulating a stable family. So usually when we think about accountability, a lot of North Korean escapees think this through unification. Since the unification situation is not really promising at this moment, they see documentation works as something not very tangible. So it's very hard to encourage their participation in this process. So what we are trying to do is to build a frame, a thought that documenting cases of human rights violation is not just for the future processes, but it could be used in the present moment. As I mentioned, it could be used through the non-judicial accountability, like through the exhibition and the museum, and how that platform could actually improve their life. So this is sort of the framing that we are trying to adopt and try to convey to the victims.